Well, welcome everyone, and I am very, very happy to have everyone here, and we are very proud to have Gregg Mitman with us. He's an environmental and medical historian. He's a Vilas Research and William Cohen Professor of History, Medical History, and Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also an award-winning author, filmmaker, and teacher whose interests span the history of science, medicine, and the environment in the United States and around the world as well. And he includes a commitment to environmental and social justice. His latest book, Empire of Rubber, Firestone's Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia, will be published in the fall of 2021, which is this year, by the New Press. And today's talk is basically the excerpt from his latest book, which Gregg will tell us a portrait of how industrial ecologies born of racial capitalism shape the relationships among people, trees, chemicals, machines, and parasites on Firestone rubber plantations in Liberia during the Second World War and post-war years. The intimate relations forged on the plantations brought benefits and burdens that differently affected lives in ways that reveal the racial logics and values of Firestone corporate culture in building plantation world. And Gregg's talks today is a part of Multispecies Worldmaking Possibilities in the More Than Human Anthropocene speaker series, which is curated by Maya Kovskaya and also organized by the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab, which Maya found and directed. Our speaker series is kindly hosted by the Integrative Center for Humanities Innovations and Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development at Chiang Mai University in Thailand. We would also want to acknowledge that this land in which we speak, work, and live belong to all trans beings, past, present, and future, including the many diverse indigenous peoples who came here, made homes long before there were states or nations. Maya, our curator, is also here with us, and she has kindly allowed a young scholar like me to be your Zoom host and help with moderation today. And my name is Aria. And before we begin, I also would like to ask everyone to mute yourself during the talk, and also turn off your video, especially during Gregg's talk. And if there's anything, you can use the chat box to leave your comments, your ideas, what you gained, what inspired you, or any questions, to use the chat box. We will have a roundtable discussions with Maya, Dania, and Zachary Caple later. And this is when we will bring all the questions and comments to have a Q&A session. This talk will end in about an hour and a half, and we would like to keep it prompt and punctual, but we hope that the discussion will not end today. We will continue the discussion through emails, through Facebook, through whatever mediums we can do. So now it is time, and we would like to invite Gregg to the floor and help guide us to what happened in Liberia.
Thank you so much, Aria. Thanks to Aria, my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and to the AMOR MUNDI Lab. And also I'm grateful to Maya and Zach for their willingness to engage with the work. So in my talk today, I want to draw upon experts from my forthcoming book that Aria mentioned, Empire of Rubber, Firestone, Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia. And those excerpts will be interspersed with interludes to pull out some of the larger themes and issues that the book addresses at the intersections of environmental history, the history of science and medicine, and the environmental humanities. So I'm going to just begin by sharing my screen, which will bring up my PowerPoint slides. And you can all see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So to begin, rubber is the most important commodity in the world, Harvey Firestone, president of the Rubber Association of America, declared in the association's more than 600 members and guests gathered at the New York City's Waldorf Astoria Hotel for an annual meeting in 1917. And this is the same year that this photo was taken with Harvey Firestone seated to my right. Thomas Edison is in the middle. John Burroughs, a famous American naturalist, is on the left. And this is one of the many camping trips that Firestone, Edison, and Henry Ford took in the teens and 20s that were much publicized and celebrated trips in American culture at the time. Many industry executives dressed in black tuxes and white bow ties laughed at such an audacious claim as they feasted upon oysters, squab, bisque glacé, and wine. The 48-year-old Firestone was dead serious. The grand ballroom in which the guests dined and where he delivered his remarks was decorated for the occasion with a lavish patriotic display of draped American flags. William Howard Taft, another famed Ohioan, was the guest of honor that evening. At 350 pounds, he was a giant of a man. Moreover, Taft, who became the first governor general of the Philippines under American occupation in 1901 and served as president of the United States from 1909 to 1913, had no qualms about throwing around the weight of private capital and government to gain economic and political advantage for American firms in foreign lands. Taft's efforts to build a civilian government in the Philippines, and in particular to secure a place for American capital where the rubber industry might, quote, grow and produce its rubber under the American flag, was welcomed with applause by the dinner guests. Noting that the United States consumed 60% of all crude rubber in the world, Taft reminded the attendees of, quote, the awkwardness of being without a supply of rubber. And this is a photo of the Firestone tire and rubber plant in Akron during this period. The increase in the demand for rubber, Taft observed, emphasizes our greater dependence upon tropical products and the greater necessity for the improvement of conditions of life and business and government in tropical countries. Firestone couldn't have asked for a speech more in keeping with where his own thoughts had begun to turn. So this scene opens the first chapter of Empire of Rubber, and the book offers a story of how a behemoth American company on a nationalist mission of profit, robed in beneficence, negotiated, maneuvered, and bullied its way into what was then one of only two sovereign Black nations on the African continent. Stepping outside America helps to make visible the structures of white privilege and power, buttressed by science and medicine, that drove the march of American capitalism and empire across the globe. But the story of Firestone in Liberia is more than a story of white supremacy and racial capitalism that powered an American family dynasty for more than half a century. It is also a history of contestation, complicity, and resistance. The leaders of a struggling Black republic maneuvered to hold their ground to save Liberia from becoming an American protectorate. From across the African diaspora, Black activists, writers, scientists, diplomats, and business people rallied to support or oppose the experiment that was Firestone in Liberia. Could the plantation free itself from the violence of land dispossession, racial exploitation, and unfree labor that shaped its history in the Atlantic world? Could American capital be trusted to respect the rights of a sovereign Black nation and its people in an imperial and colonial world? Would Firestone prove to be an angel or a devil to Liberia? Such questions swirled around the promise Harvey Firestone Sr. made to build in Liberia a modern industrial plantation that would bring great benefits to the country and its people. These questions remain today. So why Firestone? Why focus on Firestone? In exploring the role of science, medicine, and disease in the making of an industrial landscape, I used the Firestone rubber plantations in Liberia to query and push on some historiographic themes, theoretical issues, and analytic tools at the intersections of environmental history, the history of science and medicine, and the environmental humanities more generally. First is the generic use of the term ecology within environmental humanities, such that it has virtually no meaning other than relationality. Long ago, Donna Haraway pointed out the emergence of ecosystem ecology as a war baby. I saw the Firestone plantations as an opportunity to similarly interrogate how disease ecology, at least an American strand of such work, had its genealogy in biomedical research and work that took place on industrial plantations being forged through the global reach of American capital and empire. Second, if environmental history is a project in understanding how new worlds are made, then we need to shift our attention away from the state, which has dominated much scholarship in the field, to a consideration of the corporation, which has been the primary makers of worlds for much of the 20th and all of the 21st century. Firms build worlds. And we need to ask how science and medicine have been integral to making of these engineered worlds in the mine, on the plantation, and in the factory. Third, I've been increasingly concerned with the relative absence of race as an analytic category in environmental history, as well as the whiteness of the field. What productive dialogues might be forged across environmental history, history of science and medicine, and critical Black studies, for example? The granting of 1 million acres of land for a 99-year concession to Firestone by a struggling Black republic occupied considerable controversy and debate among Black writers, businessmen, politicians, and scientists across the African diaspora in the first half of the 20th century. And it offers an opportunity to explore the diverse ways in which the natural and social sciences were being appropriated and used by Black intellectuals in Africa and across the diaspora in articulating different visions of development. And just as an example, this is a photo of W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his first trip to Africa in 1924 to Liberia was initially supportive of the Firestone plantations in Liberia. He thought that Firestone had the potential here to make a plantation that would provide mutual benefits to both Liberia and the United States, provided it did not adhere to the color line and promoted Black workers up through the system. Once it became clear that Firestone was building a Jim Crow enclave on African soil, Du Bois became one of Firestone's most ardent critics. Today, in keeping with the seminar's themes, I wish to bring to the fore excerpts from the book that are informed by and touch upon writing about multi-species relationships in the making of plantation worlds. Land dispossession is always the first act in the making of a plantation world. Almost 100 years ago, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company secured a major land concession in Liberia to build a vast rubber plantation. Eager to break the British stranglehold on the world's rubber supply, Harvey Firestone looked to the tiny West African nation founded in 1847 as a sovereign Black republic to realize his dream of achieving American rubber independence. And you'll note that on this map, you can see Liberia is the only independent country in West Africa at the time, the other colonial holdings of France, Britain, and Portugal. This is what it looked like at the time when free American Blacks settled the area in Cape Montserrat. Harbel, situated 40 miles southeast of the capital city of Monrovia, in an area encircled by the Dew, Junk, and Farmington rivers, was ground central for Firestone Plantations Company, now Firestone Liberia. The area was originally home to the Bassa people, whose customary lands were claimed as public land by the Liberian government and ceded to a foreign company in the hopes of securing desperately needed capital for a struggling Black republic. Technically, the Firestone agreements excluded tribal reserves of land set aside for the communal use of any tribe within the Republic of Liberia. But the government ran roughshod over customary land claims, rendering such a clause meaningless. Stories of Firestone's initial dispossession abound. A spry old man from Suokoko who worked on and off the plantations dating back to when Edward Barclay, president from 1930 to 1944, was in the chair, which is a Liberian expression for when someone was president, told me how he and other Pele men would tease Bassa workers for trading their land to Firestone for salt and fish. But Pele people also suffered from acts of dispossession and enclosure that followed with the introduction of rubber to Liberia's rubber economy. As one Pele elder referring to rubber remarked, it came from the lands of the Kui people. They brought it here. It is what has broken our land. And Kui in Liberia means civilized or white. In Kwiza, note the place name, Kwizan. In Kwiza, the memory of displacement and the making of a plantation world haunts the stories told about the past. The place name Kwiza means the white or civilized people took us from there. Elders claim the name implicates both Firestone and the settler government in the taking of Bassa land and the displacing of their ancestors from the area where the Firestone Staff Club now sits. And this was a photo taken in 1926 of a Bassa cultural performance, which the residents of Kwiza claim happened on the near where the Firestone Staff Club now sits. An elder in Kwiza remarked that they are still waiting for Firestone to rebuild their village more than 99 years after the company took their land. Laughter erupted. The joke cuts to the bone with the pain of past deeds that severed relationships to the land and a recognition that Firestone and the Liberian state will likely never deliver justice. Other place names similarly recall the violence of land seizure. Firestone's clearing of land that became Division 22 required torching thousands of acres of cut wood, desiccated in the intense heat of Liberia's dry season. This is just a photo of one of the many fires and clearings. You can see in the photo to the left up on the hill, there's a small little hut, which gives you the scale of these fires. Firestone took care to notify town chiefs in nearby villages that they would assume no responsibility for losses incurred by fires that got out of their control. Elders suggest that these fires are the origins of the place name Wolowini, a name that refers to a part of Division 22 and means baboon burning. As recounted by a second-generation Firestone worker whose father came in 1926 to work on the plantations, people refused to move, so the whole area got burned. So the people that got burned, they named them Wolo, baboon. Violence endured by local people extended beyond the immediate loss of land and life. The making of the Firestone plantations also cut ancestral ties to the land. Esther Warner, an American artist and novelist, whose husband headed the botanical research division of the Firestone plantations, told the story of a Bassa chief, Kandia, with whom she studied West African wood and wood carving traditions. His village was marked for demolition. First, the village coffee trees, which signified a customary claim to land, were first mysteriously felled. It was a sign the plantation people would soon come, quote, break his roots and force him to go across the river, Warner learned. Dania did not want to leave his fathers long since dead, who moved among the forest trees encircling the village. But the frontier force soldiers came, destroyed the village, and Dania soon died. The planting of tree crops is recognized among Liberia's rural people as a means to secure land tenure. The destruction of these crops by multinationals is a practice repeated up to the present day in Liberia. Tree crops, including cacao, cola, orange, and rubber, along with the majestic and sacred ceiba or cotton tree, physically substantiate in the land both the memory of ancestral occupation and the powers and benefits associated with land held in common. Their physical destruction is an important act in dispossession. It is a physical erasure of past labor sedimented in the land that aided in cutting, quote, geographical ties to land and attachments to ecologies, to quote from Catherine Yusof. The process of creative destruction that Firestone claimed transformed unproductive wasteland into a profitable industrial plantation inflicted ecological violence on land and people in its alteration of life and life ways. But the process also relied upon indigenous knowledge and gendered divisions of labor embodied in Swidden agricultural practices throughout Liberia to build a new world. Among the Pele people, the ethnic group employed in the largest numbers on the Firestone plantations, Liberia's dry and wet seasons define the rhythm of life in making farms and livelihoods in the country's interior. During the dry season, from mid-December to mid-April, men clear the forest, fell the trees, burn the farm, and clear debris. These were the months when worker shortages were greatest on the Firestone plantations. The need for male labor making farms far outweighed whatever monetary benefits accrued tapping rubber. With the land cleared, women plant upland rice, usually from May to June, the beginning of the rainy season. The weeding, care, and harvesting of rice is traditionally done by women, as is the growing of cassava, swamp rice, peppers, okra, and other crops. Cash crops grown by women and sold at market are one means of empowerment for women in a patrilineal society where access to land today is still controlled largely by men. Firestone adopted the same slash and burn methods in transforming the rainforest into a profit-yielding monoculture rubber plantation. Men were contracted to fell by axe giant trees, some up to 4 feet in diameter, burn the massive dry forests, and clear the land. Tapping, which Firestone considered unskilled labor, but which in fact depends on craft knowledge to prevent damage to the tree, was also reserved for men. As women came to be employed on the plantations, and we're not quite sure when that happened, but it was not until really the early 1960s, they first found employment in the nursery farms, bringing their skills in cultivating crops to bear in the germination and nurturing of rubber seedlings. And women still do this work on the plantations. This is a photo I took in 2012 of them grafting rubber seedlings. The planting of bud grafted trees also became part of women's work on the plantations. Each day, a group of women working under a headman would be given from 4 to 6 bundles, 25 rubber stumps in a bundle, and assigned a cleared area to plant. It was laborious and careful work, supervised by white managers who would suspend or fire someone if their rows were not straight or the tree was planted loosely. Bonds were forged among women work crews, reflective of Q or communal farming practices back home, who worked under group contracts for Firestone. Fast planters came to the aid of slower ones. If you are strong, one retired worker recalled, you will leave your friends behind and finish soon. If you are slow, your friends will help you plant your remaining stumps before you can go home. Mutual aid among women laborers ensured the contract was met and helped to nurture tree crops. Other women expressed pride in the nurturing and care of seedlings now matured into productive trees, much like they would speak of the cash crops they grew on the individual farms back home. Most of the rubber trees you see, my handwork is on many, one retired woman proudly exclaimed to me. I'm going to shift to another excerpt focus. World War II proved a boon to the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, as its rubber plantations in Liberia took on strategic importance in a world at war. And this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt with President Edwin Barclay. This is the first time a sitting US president stepped foot on African soil. This was in 1943. When in December of 1941, the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor and began its sweep across the Malay Peninsula, the United States' worst fears were realized. In a matter of weeks, a region that supplied 90% of the world's natural rubber supply had fallen to the Axis powers. Suddenly, Liberia, one of the remaining strongholds of Allied natural rubber production, became critical to American economic and military interests. And this is an aerial view of what the plantations looked like in 1937, shortly before the beginning of World War II. Wartime demands for rubber helped to lock in place a set of relationships between Liberia and the US, between white managers and Black laborers, and between humans and the natural environment in this small West African nation that had emerged as a pivotal place in the wartime global economy. The intimate relations forged on the plantations among trees, parasites, chemicals, and machines brought benefits and burdens that differentially affected lives in ways that reveal the racial logics and values of Firestone's corporate culture. Firestone sold itself on a promise of benevolence to Liberia, but life and work on the plantations was highly segregated by race. At its peak in the late 1940s, the Firestone plantations employed approximately 30,000 Liberians, the majority of whom were tappers, earning 18 cents per day, supervised by roughly 125 white managers. The racial geographies visible on the nearly 200 square mile enclave and embedded in the structure and management of the plantation workforce were greatly shaped by the racial attitudes of an American company and its company town. Akron, the center of American rubber manufacturing, was one of the largest centers of the Ku Klux Klan north of the Mason-Dixon line. On the Firestone plantations in Liberia, white management performed minstrel shows in blackface at the whites-only Firestone Staff Club. This is the golf course behind the club, still exists there today. At the time in the 40s and 50s, it was for whites only. That's no longer the case. Housing and healthcare for white management. This is white management housing, and Black laborers, this is worker housing, was segregated. Medical surveillance of and drug testing on workers' bodies was routine. Such conditions reinforced the impression of African-American diplomat Edward Dudley in 1951 that Firestone was, quote, transferring US Jim Crow policies to Liberia. Tappers are the lifeblood of any rubber plantation. Without their valuable skill, knowledge, and labor, latex will not flow. The task structured a tapper's day. It set the average quota of work expected of each man. Tasking had a long history. When cotton was king in the American South, plantation owners had used it to organize the work and calculate the value of enslaved people. In the early 20th century, the task became a defining element of modern scientific management in industrial factories. In the tire building rooms of Firestone factories, and particularly on its rubber plantations, the task took on ever greater scientific precision. The task set for a tapper throughout the 1940s and 50s, when Harvey Firestone Jr. commanded Firestone's rubber empire, averaged 300 trees per day. An intimate relation was forged between tapper and tree, and that could exist for 25 years. A tree tapped with attention and care could yield latex for up to 25 years. With utmost skill, the tapper sliced a shallow cut, less than 1/16 of an inch wide, into the bark of the tree, so about 1.5 millimeters. The cut, which ran from left to right at an angle of 30 degrees to maximize the number of severed latex vessels, was a controlled wound of the tree. Cuts mimicked the harm caused by insects and thereby stimulated the plant to release its insect defense, which manifests as latex, the hydrocarbon contained in specialized cells just beneath the outer bark. A cut any wider than 1/16 of an inch wasted the tree's energy, regenerating bark. A cut any deeper than 1 millimeter, the thickness of a dime, risked damaging the tree. If a tapper cut into the cambium, he risked injuring the vital xylem and phloem, the tree's transport highways that carry water, minerals, and sugars where they are needed. A wound too wide or too deep, and the tapper could shorten the life of the rubber tree. Firestone invested more in the life of a tree than that of a tapper. It didn't take too many wounds before a tapper found himself without a job. In the transformation of land and ecological relations that built and sustained plantation worlds, Firestone exacerbated certain disease risks and introduced new harms. The making of an industrial landscape was fraught with worker risks. The clearing of land, the recruitment of labor, and the destruction of flora and fauna opened up possibilities for opportunistic insects, along with the parasites they carried, to thrive. The human-loving blackfly, Similium yahense, was one. The waterways critical to the plantation's infrastructure, along with windbreaks and shade furnished by the monoculture rubber forests, offered an ideal habitat for the biting black fly. Most active in the morning when tappers were at work, Similium yahense found an abundance of human meals on the plantation. As black flies and people moved to the plantation, they brought along a fellow traveler, the parasitic worm, Onchocerca volvulus. Like its insect collector, flourished in the ecological conditions of the Harbel plantations. Transmitted to its human host via the black fly, the parasite is one of the leading causes of blindness in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the tropical world. On the divisions along the Dew River, onchocerciasis, or river blindness, became much more prevalent than elsewhere in Liberia. 60 years after the first divisions were cleared, the prevalence of onchocerca infection among male laborers living near the Dew River averaged 80%. Chemicals that proliferated throughout the plantation complex were another health risk. Chemicals like ammonia were vital to the operation of the plantation. Ammonia, a constant companion in the life of a tapper, was critical to keeping latex in a liquid state. Yet tappers used the chemical without gloves or protective eye gear. It saturated the pores of a tapper's hands, deadened fingertips, and destroyed nails. Once they filled your ammonia bottle, one tapper recalled, you had to close it quickly or it may waste on you and burn your skin. Some went blind when the corrosive and caustic chemical got into their eyes. When it flashed in your eyes, it spoiled it, Bay said. If it is all two of your eyes, it will spoil it. Many other hazardous chemicals came onto the Firestone plantations in the post-war years. The Second World War had spawned an abundance of new chemical compounds. With them came grand schemes for large-scale industrial agriculture, green revolution, and feeding a hungry world. Labor sprayed 2,4,5-T on old rubber trees. Then tractors cleared the dead, defoliated vegetation away to make room for new plantings of rubber tree clones. The herbicide had other beneficial effects. It leached into the soil and killed fungi responsible for root rot, a major disease that threatened the health and productivity of Firestone's rubber trees. But the herbicide contained small amounts of highly toxic environmental pollutant, dioxin. Scientists paid no attention to the chemical's possible health effects on workers or on communities living downstream from the Harbel plantations along the Dew and the Farmington rivers. And this is the main plant at Harbel. You can see the river just behind the Farmington, which goes to the Atlantic Ocean and where Firestone would dump its waste. Little was natural about the production of natural rubber in the post-war years. Firestone laborers lived and worked in a plantation world teeming with biological, chemical, and physical risks. During the war years, lawsuits against the company brought by Liberian workers injured on the job or by surviving families who had lost a loved one in an industrial accident became more common. In response to increased pressure by the Liberian government, Firestone put a worker compensation policy in place. But its death benefit came nowhere close to the damages that families of Firestone workers who died on the job sought. In 1946, a tapper's life was valued by Firestone at $252, which would be $3,348 US in today, provided the cause of death was not worker negligence. A foot amounted to compensation of $126. A hand was worth the same. An eye, 640 times a worker's wages when a tapper earned 18 cents per day. In the calculus of workers' compensation, Firestone disclosed the value it placed on the lives of Black laborers in the Jim Crow enclave it had imported to Liberia. It was a valuation founded upon structures of racial capitalism rooted in the violent and bloody soil plantation slavery. Firestone touted its Liberia plantations as an exemplar of modern industry and progress, buttressed by the transformative power and humanitarian benefits of American science and medicine. But in its segregated and unequal treatment of white and Black workers, support of racist science and medicine, and extraction and export of wealth amassed from confiscated lands, Firestone shared more in common with past plantation worlds than it stood apart from them. And I'm just going to conclude now. In a 2013 report published by the US National Academy of Sciences, the authors described the wave of transnational land acquisitions over the last decade by foreign investors in sub-Saharan Africa and other regions across the globe as a, quote, new form of colonialism. The case of land grabs in Liberia raises the question, what is new? As Charlene Mallet argues, and I quote, land grabbing can only be conceptualized as new or novel if scholars continue to ignore enduring racial logics and accompanying racial discourses embedded in natural resource conflicts. The racial logics of capital, whereby the making of racial difference in land and labor justified Western exploitation and economic domination of regions like Liberia, reveal themselves time and again in the sedimentary histories of land concessions brokered by corporate empires like Firestone and settler elites in the need of capital and territory to protect Liberia's sovereignty as a nation from the imposing imperial powers of Great Britain and France, whose colonies bordered Liberia. Such agreements have been transformative of the social life of land in Liberia. They concentrated power in an oligarchy, exacerbated inequality, and planted the seeds of discontent and revolution among the country's plantation laborers and subsistent farmers, increasingly dispossessed of land upon which livelihoods were, and still are, being made. The land and surrounding infrastructure of the Firestone plantation complex bears witness to storied layers of dispossession and destruction, promises made and broken, growth without development, and the extractive nature of plantation economies. This is a photo of Simdarbe, which is a a large concession, more than 500,000 acres, that was granted to a Malaysian oil palm plantation company in 2009, and it was built on a previous concession that was given to BF Goodrich. But as you drive along the 40-mile stretch of highway from Harbel, the center of Firestone's operations, to Monrovia, you will see plots everywhere of half-built cinder block homes, of gardens with peppers, pineapples, or potato greens, of planted tree crops such as palm, papaya, banana, and coconut. Such plots stand in contrast to the plantation, and here I'm gesturing to the work of Sylvia Winter. These are plantings in keeping with customary rights to land, use rights that secure tenure, however ephemeral, in defiance of legal definitions of private property that settler elites and multinationals in the past have sought to impose. In 2018, the Liberian legislature passed the Land Rights Act, which for the first time in Liberia's history gives legal rights and protection to the majority of Liberian citizens who live in rural areas and who own their lands collectively according to customary laws. Whether Liberia law will now stand behind such acts of cultivation remains to be seen. Regardless, the planting and cultivation of subsistence and cash crops on whatever small plots of land can be claimed will continue with or without the backing of the state. Of this, one can be sure. Land is life in Liberia. Access to it will not be, nor has it ever been, surrendered easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for a very, very insightful talk. And I believe we have learned so much from this as well. And it's such a beautiful and very, I think, thought-provoking, and trying to get us to think even more, especially in the context of Southeast Asia now, where we see a lot more plantations happening and maybe repeating some histories that we have heard from Liberia. And this kind of, what I hear a lot is the attention to the intimate relationships between the tapas, the rubber trees, the flies and the parasites and the chemicals in the rivers, and also with racial segregation, injustice that all entangle in this kind of corporate culture, building within and beyond the plantation worlds, like you have shown us with Firestones. There's a lot of discussions and questions in the chat box as well regarding this, including the mutual relationships among women, to racial segregations practiced among white Americans and colonial Europeans. Also talking about rubbers from Brazil, and many of these Greg has briefly introduced to. So in order to keep the momentum going, and I believe our audience is really eager to hear more from our discussants as well, I would like to introduce our discussants. We have Zachary Caple here with us as well. He is a postdoctorate fellow with the Anthropocene Heathland Group in RSS University. I'm sorry, I mispronounced it. His research examines human-altered landscape changes of the Holocene, Anthropocene planetary transition. He received his doctorate in anthropology from University of California, Santa Cruz in 2017, and was a research scientist at University of South Florida from 2017 to 2021. His dissertation, very interesting and very fit into our talk today as well, is Holocene in Fragments, a critical landscape ecology of phosphorus in Florida, which examines the phosphate fertilizer industry and the human-altered phosphorus cycle more broadly as an agent of environmental violence and capitalist growth. His work on chemical fertilizers and their role in the formation of plantationocene has been featured in Technosphere, which is a collaboration of the Hulls, the Kutter, and the Wolf, Connectedness an incomplete encyclopedia of Anthropocene, and most recently, an online collaboration, Fear Atlas, which our curators just released her article, a review of Fear Atlas. Me and Dania, our next discussant, she is a lecturer currently at Mafalong University and also studying her PhD at Chiang Mai University at the Faculty of Social Science. She's also a member of AMOR MUNDI lab here. Her research will be focusing on the predicament along the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects in the Mekong River. And she will examine water energy nexus at a scalable frontier in Capitalocene, trophic cascade, riparian biodiversity, and multi-species entanglement of the more than human world of Mekong phytoplankton and women of color in the global south. She has tons of experience prior to her PhD program in many Southeast Asian educational institutions, the UNDP, as well as published in many academic articles and chapters as well. So her focus is on gender precarity and unnatural disaster in Southeast Asia. So all of our discussant is here on the floor, and I would like to give all this time to you to discuss and guide us through this multi-species world as well.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start. Gregg, thank you very much for your talk. It was beautiful, and the project is so urgent and artfully crafted. I can't wait to hold a physical copy of the book in my hands. So congratulations, and I hope that it's taking you all the places you want to go. I guess I'm interested in some very basic questions to begin. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what you think a plantation is, and the theory of the plantation that underlies the book or that emerged for you in the writing of the book. And I'm interested in these kind of big general questions about what a plantation is, in part because it seems like plantation studies is a new emerging field that you in part have been key in developing. And I'm interested in what you think plantation studies is, and maybe you would want to reflect a little bit about organizing this Sawyer lecture series on the Plantationocene, but telling us a little bit about this emerging discipline, how the book fits into it or speaks to it, and maybe where you see the future of Plantationocene studies going. So big questions, but I'm dying to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach. What is a plantation? We certainly wrestled with that question in the Sawyer seminar. You know, for me, it is a large. It's a cultivation that is dependent upon large scale monoculture, dependent upon massive amounts of human labor. You know, that's built in a way that wealth is extracted from the land and goes off site. And, you know, so in the case of Firestone, for example, 3 out of every $4 earned on the plantations made its way back to the United States. You know, I would say, I would just remind us that plantation studies is not a new field, that there's actually a long history, and particularly within critical Black studies and you know, scholars, beginning with Du Bois, actually, you know, and even before, that were thinking quite critically and theoretically about the plantation and its legacy. So I wouldn't want to, you know, and I think we really need to acknowledge that body of scholarship that's come before. You know, it's really interesting. When we started this Sawyer seminar, we had a seminar. It's called a Sawyer seminar. It was funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. and it was called Interrogating the Plantationocene. And we meant that interrogating seriously. That is, none of us, myself, my colleague Monique Allowert, Pablo Gomez, Sophie Sapmore, were the main organizers. And we brought in speakers over the course of well, 2 years. We're actually having the last one next week. None of us were committed to the concept of the Plantationocene. And in fact, I would say that I am very hesitant about using it now after that seminar. It never appears in the book. Because one of the things that we came to understand is that particularly within the United States and the U.S. South, the kind of pain and trauma that the plantation has caused and continues to exist for people of color, to like scale that up to the global level is really problematic. And the other thing that I think, and it's great to be talking to a group, that's largely based, as I understand, in East and Southeast Asia, where the plantation has a kind of somewhat different, I see in the chat actually similarities, but we had a number of students involved in the seminar who were doing work in Southeast Asia, and there the plantation formations were different. And so I think it's the problem of scaling up any concept to the global level is the things that get made invisible. And so so I'm actually very reluctant in many ways to use that term.
Thanks.
So Maya, Dania, you hear a bit of a Southeast Asia perspective. What are the things that after you hear, can you reflect a bit on what you have heard from Gregg as well?
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Mitman, for sharing a beautiful and powerful knowledge. I'm kind of speechless. And also to Achan Dr. Maya Kovskaya to build the space for us to share and discuss this important topic. So this book by Professor Mitman is a book that every social, political, economy, and political ecology should have on his or her reference bookshelf. I believe that it provokes discussions on multi-perspective of the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene's contents, and opens more investigations in also for my current study in multispecies ecofeminism relevant in the global South context. So in discussing Professor Mitman's book, The Empire of Rubber, Firestone, Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia, especially excerpted from the chapter 6, The Plantation Lives. If I were to adopt Professor Mitman's explanations about the Liberia plantations lives in Southeast Asia or in greater Mekong subregions context, I would certainly ask myself, as Professor Mitman also showed in the preface part of the book, if I have misread the landscape when I arrived in my neighborhood plantations. Living in Chiang Rai, the northernmost part of Thailand back to 2016. I'm an Indonesian, but I live in Chiang Rai now. I did not realize that I surrounded by plantations. Most of time I went to like the tea and coffee plantations just to escape from office routines and experience the authentic taste of plantations product. Similar activities maybe like Malaysians, Indonesians will do in their spare time in their country. Relaxing in a tea or coffee plantations up in the hill is always fun. But now I know that I have misread, haven't I? I should have paid more attention, not only to the authentic taste of the plantation, but the leaves, the multi-species entanglement leaves. So from Professor Mitman discussion this evening and in this book, the professor asked us to notice how racism is actually visible through the architectural spatial landscape. So spatial is spatial. Spatial is spatial. Like for example, in the book, professor said that the foreign white management staff enjoy white privileged plantation facilities and comfortable housings, and their buildings were segregated from the color-skinned African indigenous workers, purposefully separated from the workers' division camp. And the white workers' properties were built on a hill in higher elevations to give them protections from the bite of the female, what is the name of the mosquito? Anopheles or something, Anopheles mosquito, the one that causing the malaria. And the opposite workers, the color African indigenous, they live in low-lying areas and swamp, facing, like professor said, the forced connection with the malaria parasite carrier mosquito. And the biomedical facilities were built for the benefit of the plantation workers. But actually it's not for the workers' benefit themselves, but actually to protect the capital resources. So in here, I found the capitalism contradictions. Like professor said about the tappers were the most essential and the work needed continuous activities with detailed technique of glass latex collections, how to get the white gold of the latex, balancing bucket like you showed in the pictures of milk white latex, transporting it. But the work of the tappers was classed as unskilled labor category. Yes, they were the most essential one, but they were not valued enough. They were not entitled equal health benefit. Moreover, their salary and other facilities like the white privilege got. So I have two central inspirations I get from reading Professor Mitman's Empire of Rubber book, and from our great friend Zach, an article on the plantationocene. So the starting point here is to get a better understanding of capitalist nature in the plantationocene, to suggest our current ecological crisis rooted in historical plantations. So given the strong association between what Zach already asked, the philosophical conceptions on the earth and capitalism, Zach, also Professor Mitman, with Anna Singh, with Donna Haraway, have proposed the potential thinking with the plantationocene, considering the plantation is the ongoing place in the capitalist world economy and global ecological change involving racializations and colonization. So I would like to mark what Zach has also beautifully wrote, a parable of rabbits. It's very interesting to explain the plantation as a machine for massifying life. It's a truly clear definitions to keep pace with the replications of the rabbit. Carrots must be grown in plantation system in a hierarchical trophic relations, an engineered network of eating and being eaten. The plantation system leaves traces in the earth. The phosphate it's essential to growing the carrot. So I quote some words from Zach also. Capital feeds on labor as rabbits feed on carrots. So the plantations is a reproductive social structures that operates through many translations, like Zach asked to Professor Mitman last time. Phosphate rocks, carrot, rabbits, labor, capital. Each of these translations is likewise a kind of slavery, right? And these subjugations constitute a kind of tropic violence, like Achan Maya always said, like tropic violence, legitimates and perpetuated by what could be described as the Western racial imagination. So from Professor Mitman in his interview, like I read that with Singh and Haraway at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Professor mentioned that the plantation is also an alienating workplace, regardless of whether It employs human or non-human. So it disrupts the generation times of all players, radically simplify the numbers of players, and set up situation for the fast proliferations of some and removal of others. So the plantation was precisely the conjuncture between ecological simplifications and disciplines of plants in particular, and also disciplines of human to work on those. So my first impression, Professor Mitman at Another Dimensions to Define Plantation Lives and Condition in his book, I quote the word chattel slavery, because the plantation was an economic, agricultural, social system of productions built upon the theft of indigenous land, just like in the chatting said that, oh, the tree is coming from the Brazil itself and it's spread out through Southeast Asia. And as we look back to the Madeira and the New World discovery, human slaves were imported from Africa to America also. And the second, in my background from Southeast Asian studies, the book connects the history of plantations in Africa continent to the history of the First and the Second World War, in which Southeast Asia includes in the contextualizing the importance of rubber for the capitalists in the Northern Hemisphere. I think Anna Singh also somehow connected the Anthropocene with the rubber plantations in Indonesia. As also Professor Mitman mentions, the crude rubber in terms of dollar value was the single most important commodity imported to the United States, but the large number of plantation in Southeast Asia accounted for more than 98% of all rubber produced in the world, not to mention other forms of plantations commodities, tea, coffee, sugar, palm oil, and this is the most sensitive issue in Indonesia, tobacco and clove, as well as the rubber and banana plantations in Greater Mekong subregion. So as a Southeast Asian native, I might say, plantation issue is not a quite popular topic to be discussed among social and political scientists. Meanwhile, we are living around plantation landscape. So plantation is our building reality in a backgrounding narrative. Our culture, I suspect, is thickly influenced by plantation value planted by European colonialism back in the 16th, 17th century, racism, sexism, speciesism, hierarchical dualism. The question is, until when we misread our landscape? And when will we realize the independence that we foreground in our national history is not equal to all, as long as plantation system still covers more than 90% of our land? I think that's all that I can deliver, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maya. A lot in there. I guess one word of caution, I think, I think it's, it's important in terms of the group gathered here and really thinking about multi-species relations. I would never want to equate the violence, the kind of violence that happens to human laborers on the plantation with as akin to violence to other forms of life. I see those as very, very different, and that we should be very careful not to flatten that. That quote, that Anna Singh's quote about the slavery of plants has gotten a lot of pushback, and I think rightly by folks in critical Black studies that see that as equating the kind of trauma and pain of 400 years of human slavery with that of plants, right? So we need to be really, really, I think, conscious and careful about that in how we put together, I think in terms of writing and bringing together these multi-species relationships that at the same time is very conscious of different powers and moralities and ethics at work. And, you know, so, and, you know, it's something that I thought a lot about in writing the book. I know, you know, in some ways, you know, I suspect that people more committed to kind of multi-species and honoring relationalities would say that there's not enough about the tree and you know, other organisms in those plantation worlds. But it's partly because my commitments are really around issues of human and environmental and social injustice. So much to say. I see there's so many comments, which is also on the side. I mean, I love your point also, Maya, about misreading the landscape, and you know, as you mentioned in the preface, I talk about how I so misread the landscape when I first went to Liberia. Because I knew nothing, you know, and it's interesting. Just a little anecdote. I mean, I didn't expect I was going to be writing a book about plantations. How I came on this project was I came across film footage from a 1926 Harvard expedition to Liberia. It was a medical and biological survey. I thought I was going to be writing about the history of American biomedical research in Liberia. And one of the research techniques that we developed was that we retraced the itinerary of the expedition with these photos and film footage where they were taken, and get people to respond to them as kind of a, you know, interactive feedback interviews. And, you know, people didn't really, the biomedical stuff, they didn't really react to. What everybody responded to was about land and land dispossession, and how Firestone, as they say in Liberia, plated the mat, meaning that there's a Liberian turn of phrase about new mats are plated on old ones, and that means you're sitting on a Rafa mat, an old Rafa mat, to plate a new one. And they say Firestone plated the old mat on which the new mats, meaning this new wave of oil palm concessions that are happening in Liberia, were built. And that's what really, the more time I spent in Liberia, the more I began to understand land and the land tenure and tree crops, and the importance of tree crops to land tenure. You know, one of my dear colleagues who's taught me so much. I mean, the first thing that we did when he bought a plot of land in Liberia is we went out and planted coconut trees, because there's, you know, land tenure is so insecure, but if you have tree crops on there, it suggests that, you know, you have some kind of occupation on it. And yeah, I think, so land really, you know, becomes an operative and an important operative in an analytic category, which, you know, your comments bring out. I'm trying to capture as many of the comments on the side. I want to acknowledge something that, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Binta Mupisa remarked about how he, in his village and his own family, have rubber trees. And that's also the case in Liberia, where Firestone, as part of their strategy of cultivating elites, is that they provided free rubber seedlings to anybody that wanted them, and also would buy rubber at the going wholesale rate. What that did was it led to this concentration of autocratic power. So if you look at the areas surrounding the Firestone rubber plantation of landholders, there's a group Liberian elites that seized land and built, made their own rubber plantations. So William Tubman, who was president of Liberia from 1944 to 1971, was the largest independent rubber grower in Liberia. And he would use his power as president to squelch strikes on the plantations, because if Firestone was having to pay workers more, then he was having to pay his own workers more. But there's also small independent rubber farmers where you don't have this plantation style, but you have an intercropping system that's happening. And I'm engaged in a little bit on the side, but engaged in a project on the Liberian Guinea border, where there's been a planting of 40 acres of oil palm, but it's intercropped with other cash crops, and trying to use that to within an agricultural collective that the hope is that it will support a school that we built there. So it's a rubber does not necessarily need to be grown plantation style. Obviously, it's there's an economy of scale there, but it can as Bintar mentioned, be grown other ways. And in Brazil, where the Hevea brasiliensis, as people mentioned, was stolen, in Brazil, it actually can't grow plantation style because of a fungus that exists in that habitat that will decimate the rubber if it grows in closer concentrations to one another. And that's what Ford's problem was when he tried to build a large rubber plantation in Brazil. In Southeast Asia and Liberia, that fungus is not present, and it's why they were able to develop it. It's Hevea brasiliensis is first developed as a plantation crop in Southeast Asia. Those clones are then taken and planted in Liberia.
Where there's a different fungal ecology. There aren't the kind of funguses that the tree had evolved with in the Amazon. So you're
exactly
able to have monoculture, but over time the fungus kind of catches up, or the pathogens end up catching up with the monocrop, and they find this big cache of delicious rubber trees, and your crop is gone, right? So that leads to these boom and bust cycles, right? And I guess there's something in that where you're kind of capturing the kind of long distance relationalities that come with the plantation and the capitalist system, but also all kinds of human and non-human intimacies. And it seems to me that this book is kind of tracking the geometry of the plantation at so many different scales and in so many different ways. It's really impressive. But I guess I want to, while we have you, I just want to ask one question about how you see the corporate plantation as being different, or in some ways articulating with the colonial plantation, because it seems in some way that there's something different about the way corporations build worlds, right? And it's in some ways the success of those projects comes from being haunted by the colonial plantation, even as they distance themselves through it, through philanthropic projects of various sorts, or what have you, improved living conditions. So if you're willing to riff on that, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be done on, the kind of world building practices of corporations that, we really need to engage with. And I understand the problem. The problem is access. Right, access to company archives, and being able to even get on, Firestone allowed me on the plantations once, and I was closely monitored the whole time. I was controlled about who I could talk to and all of that. And they even though their archives were at a public university, the University of Akron, for more than 4 decades, they've denied people access, historians access to it, including Liberians. And, you know, and so for this story has been, you know, people, and certainly Liberian scholars have, you know about Firestone, and people have tried to write this story in the past, but, you know, the inability of access has made it impossible, but that doesn't mean it is impossible. You know, and, you know, you can piece it together through a lot of different ways, which I tried to do in the book. The different, you know, the how is the corporate plantation different than the colonial one? You know, so obviously, you know, in, you know, free labor. So this is wage labor. And, you know, Firestone really touted that. You already mentioned, Zach, in terms of welfare capitalism. So as the plantation systems today are still providing worker housing, providing health care, providing education, Firestone had its has to this day a school system for plantation workers up to the 8th grade. So you know, there is you know, there is definitely some ways in which it has distanced itself. And yet I was also really interested in those resonances and legacies, you know, for example, the task system, right? The way in which racial segregation happens, which, I mean, and it was, what's so bizarre is that, you know, Liberia is a sovereign Black republic, but in 1958, it had to pass, and it's a sovereign Black republic where whites cannot own land, nor can whites be citizens. Yet in 1958, the Liberian legislature had to pass an anti-segregation law to deal with the segregation practices that were happening on the Firestone plantations, you know, which is kind of crazy. So, you know, but then there's also, you know, interesting dimensions too, in terms of differences, thinking about labor organization, strikes. You know, the first strikes really started beginning on the Firestone plantations in the 1950s. You know, and also connected to international labor organizations. So there's, you know, a whole dimension around labor politics and the corporate plantation, and thinking about that both, you know, regionally and internationally. That is different than thinking about like the colonial, you know, plantation as well. So yeah, great questions. You know, I really encourage us to, you know, particularly get this group, you know, of, you know, building kind of multi-species worlds. Like, to me, that there's so much we need to do on corporate world building.
Thanks.
I have one question from Binta, just to continue the discussion a bit as well. And we also have a lot of friends from Myanmar who having a lot of long history, like Indonesia, with plantations as well. For Binta, he asked, like he mentioned before, about rubber plantations are owned by local people, unlike the case like it's owned by a transnational company like Firestone. However, the scale is really super large. So can we call this as part of the empire, even though the rubber is not owned by a company? That was his question.
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the question. Can you repeat it, Arya?
Yes, I believe what he is saying is that from the example in Liberia, that when you name the book Empire of Rubber, it was a case that is the plantation and the area controlled and managed by Firestone. Whereas in Indonesia, the rubber is grown everywhere, grown by local people on their land, not really owned by or guided or managed by a certain companies. But because of the super large scale that's happening, can we consider this as part of the empire of rubber as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, Indonesia is an interesting counterexample in the way, as my understanding, and again, my knowledge is quite superficial, but Bintar's, remarks about his own family and villages where independent small rubber farmers are actually able to develop successful livelihoods and outperform some of the corporate plantations. So I guess I wouldn't see that necessarily as an extent of the empire of rubber, but rather kind of gesturing what I was doing at the end of the talk to thinking about, and this is Sylvia Winter's concept of the plot, as a kind of means of resistance against the plantation. And so, I would need to know a lot more about who's buying that rubber from these, rubber farmers, how dependent upon them, how dependent are those rubber farmers on those buyers. I mean, there's got to be a corporation somewhere behind that, right? Because it's they're selling it to somebody. And what kind of dependencies or not exist between these independent rubber farmers, and the corporation that's buying it. I mean, in the case of Liberia, for example, they're wholly dependent upon Firestone. They have no other markets to go to, so it's still it's a monopoly still, right? But they're able to grow it in different ways.
Yeah, I guess I don't know much about Indonesia now either, but in Thailand we would be hearing about like contract farming or selling it to the middle person who then sell it to whoever the bigger person. Yes, like
Right.
in Indonesia, it's probably for export to like China, to other places as well.
Right.
But also contracted to a company. So we
Right.
have, I guess, so many models that's happening here.
Yeah, and when we're talking about contract farming, then we're in a kind of tenant system, right? That can be, equally exploitative, right?
I think Yogi's question kind of relates to this a little bit, and Yogi would like to have Gregg explain a bit more what do you mean by there's a lot to be done in corporate world building?
Yeah, what I mean by that is that, at least in the, I mean, my main field, or what I've been trained in is both the history of science and medicine and environmental history. And, a lot of the focus historically has been on the power of the state and looking at the power of the state, and whether it's in terms of colonialism and imperialism and or whatnot. But I see environmental history as a project of the history of world making, right? And if that's the case, if we look at, well, what are the major institutions say in the 20th century and the 21st century that have reshaped the planet? And those are corporations. And so, I think as, Zach's last question was alluding to, those corporations have histories. They have their own particular kinds of cultures. Multinationals have certain kinds of practices that they use, whether they're operating in, in Indonesia or Liberia, in terms of how they win over local peoples, to give over their land and so forth. I mean, and they bring it, there's science involved, there's a medicine, in many cases, medicine involved, in terms of the ways in which they're reordering life, and labor. And I think rather that really understanding those logics is important. And how, for example, does, making steel and steel manufacturing and so forth, because Liberia sits also on the largest iron ore deposits in West Africa. So by the 1950s, iron ore concessions had subverted rubber concessions, and it was largely through U.S. steel companies, right? Does that culture operate differently than, say, a rubber manufacturing? How are those worlds different? So that's kind of what I'm getting at here.
And I think I would like to draw this into kind of more contemporary setting and the questions by Mayakovskaya. And this related a bit on China and possibly its role in both Africa and Asia as well. She asked that in order to help students like us to draw on case studies with different historical and cultural context in ways that can analytically bring out rather than erase relevant differences that are consequential. So she wondered how can we learn from other colonial plantation histories to interrogate the increasingly massive role played by China's. So instead of corporate, we have the Belt and Road initiatives and attendant industrial infrastructure developments, not just rubber or plantations, but we have bananas as well that's proliferating across Southeast Asia and Africa, both echo and differ from the earlier European American colonial models, which we have touched upon a little bit earlier as well. And this relate to racial relations are different, yet distinctly Chinese form of racialized hierarchy is nonetheless present, and the backgrounding and denied dependency and hierarchical dualism at work may not geologically derive from Cartesian dualism, like many of us have learned on this, yet it's similar form of radical exploitation of nature and racialized hierarchies that are not rooted in white supremacy are also present. So I guess when we talk about multi-species, many of us learn about white supremacy and Cartesian dualism. But when the context now moved and changed to policies like the Belt and Road initiatives, how can we learn and compare all these case studies and contexts to study about China's role as well?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic projects that await. I mean, that's one of the things really striking to me in Liberia is how strong China's presence is. I actually, a few years ago, said to the American ambassador, I said the Chinese embassy is bigger than the US embassy in Monrovia, which they took issue with. But if you look, it's largely Chinese companies that are in Liberia, trying to get iron ore concessions, road building, range of things that are happening, and really understanding, doing a kind of comparative framework in how that means, their means of gaining access and control is similar or different than what happened in terms of American imperialism. I think there's so much to be done there. And then also how that, in terms of thinking about labor relations and the way in which labor is organized, is really important too. I'm very interested in these, not just China, but as I said, Malaysian oil palm companies that have been granted these large concessions in Liberia, and what can we learn by looking at those corporate cultures compared to, say, American corporate cultures in their operations, and the way in which they're thinking about capital, labor, nature, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there's there's so much, and we see this already playing out, excuse me, in the context of COVID and vaccine diplomacy. China was really quick to offer vaccines to Africa ahead of the United States. U.S. is now kind of speeding forward on that, but less than 3% of Africans have been vaccinated, and there's a way in which, similar to what Firestone did in terms of medical humanitarianism in the context of COVID, this new medical humanitarianism, particularly around distribution, making available and distributing vaccines in Africa, one can see as an opportunity for gaining also access to vital natural resources. So, I think we haven't talked, because the book is really on plantations, where we're talking about other living beings. We haven't really talked about thinking about the mine, but that's another important place, where these multi-species relations come into view, and certainly very active in sub-Saharan Africa. So
I believe we're basically towards the end as well, and Gregg has a class to teach later, so we don't want him to be late for his class. So I would like to ask Zach and Maya to leave some final words before Gregg leave us, basically close this talk and continue this talk virtually elsewhere, but not to forget to buy his book as well. So I ask Zach first then.
Oh, I wasn't expecting this. Okay.
Just kind of reflection.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Gregg. I mean, it's beautiful, and I'm so interested to read the book, but also to translate it into my own work and think with you. And so, yeah, I mean, one question I didn't get to ask and I wanted to know more about was, how do we think about the ecological and social afterlife of the plantation? Because it's not only that Firestone continues to produce in this area, but there's all kinds of ruins mixed in there. So there's so much more to talk about, but we'll have to read the book.
From me, thank you, Professor Gregg, for showing us that sometimes we have to realize that we have misread something about our own landscape, that we think we know it exactly, but it's still a misreading on the landscape. And how you particularly show us how to pay attention to relational perspective in the plantation landscape. It's very important topic indeed. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for really engaging so thoughtfully with the work. And again, to Maya and Aria for the opportunity, and to all of you in the audience that have been, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all your questions and comments, and so much there, but I hope the conversation continues. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, the audience, for being here. Thank you, our host, RCSD and the Integrative Center of Humanities Innovations. And I think we will continue, maybe if everyone get a chance to have a copy of a book, to have a reading group to continue this discussion and how, and maybe see how, maybe in the future collaboration between Zach and Gregg to talking about plantation runes as well. And yeah, so we look forward to our speakers, our audience to continue this work, to keep in touch. You can reach us on Facebook. We will post this video on YouTube, and reach out to our email, or maybe email Gregg, go to his website, go to all of our speakers' website, continue to talk about this and explore more about multi-species entanglement. So thank you, good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everyone. ขอบคุณค่ะ บ๊ายบาย
Thank you.